Hi, how are you? Long time no see. And today's topic is ancient Greece. And to start, ancient Greece is one of those very historically important topics that our age doesn't talk about. Where I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday where we were talking about how in our grandparents' time, when you started going to school, you were taught Plato and Aristotle. That was just the foundation of education. And we were saying how the fact that we were never taught Plato and Aristotle, it set us back two intellectual levels, where as a species, intellectually, culturally, militarily, politically, and much of our society comes from ancient Greece. And this was something our ancestors knew, where for the Western tradition, they prized what the Greeks talked about. And so they found that the Greeks were able to just build up this beautiful foundation of a civilization. And from that, they would read authors like Plato or Aristotle or all these ancient Greek thinkers. And if you read histories from the 19th century, they are just completely gushing about Greece. If you read authors from, like, let's say Edward Gibbon Edward Gibbon was writing at the time of the American Revolution until World War II, it was widely held up that the Greeks were the most impressive nation that had ever existed in history. And so let's get into ancient Greece.
Let's do it.
We are going to cover the time period from the ancient Dark Ages until Alexander the Great. And so this video is ancient Greece, not the ancient Greeks, because the period we're talking about was when the Greeks were still in Greece. And so after this, Alexander the Great conquers the entirety of the Middle East out to India, and then the events of what Greeks were doing became largely more so in the Middle East or North Africa, or through indirect influence through Rome. And Greece has an interesting geography. And I've heard some historians say that Greece has a geography that parallels Europe. You look at Europe as a continent, it's all these peninsulas, it's surrounded by ocean, all these islands, jagged geography. And Greece is like that too, where Greece is just, if you vomit on the map, it looks like Greece, where it's all these jagged mountains and peninsulas and that stuff. And there's theories that this created a social structure that was similar between the Greeks and the Europeans. And I think people overestimate our cultural similarity with the Greeks, but there is definitely a thread of Western civilization. And at the previous Bronze Age world, Greece was a peripheral player. And in the Bronze Age world, this is like 2000 BC to 1200 BC. And Eric Klein's got a really interesting book about the Bronze Age collapse. And the Bronze Age collapse was this time period where every major country of the Middle Eastern world system, because the Middle East was the most important place in the world in this time period, shattered in a single generation. So you have the Hittites in Turkey, you have the Syrian kingdoms, Elam in Western Iran, and they were all wiped out except for Babylon and Egypt. And Greece was a kingdom called the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites, because we have records of the Hittites and the Greeks talking to each other. The Hittites were an Indo-European people in Turkey. They were possibly the greatest power of that time, where the Mycenaean Greeks, they were called Anahawiya by the Turks. And they were at war. And so Greece and the Hittites were at war in the Bronze Age world. And the Mycenaean Greeks, or the Greece was unified under the Mycenaean kingdom before the Bronze Age, Dark Age. And it was a very aristocratic, a very top-down society, where we found the ruins of the capital, Mycenae, and it's very wealthy, centrally organized, and it was this very warrior tribal society, because both the ancestors of the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, they were Aryans, and the Aryans were this people from modern Ukraine who had settled this whole area from Ireland to India. Actually, it would be a dope video if the next one was on the Indo-European or Aryan invasions. That would really be a dope next video. But they conquered the local peoples, and for South Europeans, they're about 2/3 to 3/4 Aryan genetics and 2/3 local population. They installed themselves as a new ruling class, and for the entire Greek period, and this is a thread Nietzsche pulls on a lot, the Greeks have this warrior aristocratic culture, and it's counterbalanced with the later rationality and skepticism. But if you could find a single word to summarize the ancient Greek character, you would say aristocratic. It's a very noble aristocratic society, and that permeates across their entire social structure. Where, for example, the Greeks, they had logic. They invented early versions of the computer, and they had these like cogs that would move around. It's technically a computer, and they used it to predict astrological signs. And they invented the steam engine too. And they also had fertilizer. But the reason they didn't use fertilizer, the steam engine, or a computer is because using your understanding to change the world was ungentlemanly, because the gentlemanly thing to do was to just be completely in your head and not have to toil on the physical world, because that was what peasants do. And so this sense of nobility, and it also permeates into Greek philosophy, or it permeates into philosophy. It permeates into their ideas of citizenship, because the Greek concept of democracy came from this Aryan warband system where whoever has force has power. And so democracies come from warband cultures, because if everyone fights, everyone gets a vote. And also the rationalistic tradition also came from the Aryan noble heritage. And it's interesting, I've read a lot of books that compare India to Greece. And so you see parallels between Indian civilization and Greek civilization, where it's this same scientific, inquisitive mind. But for the Greeks, it went into philosophy and rationalism, and for India, it went into religion. And so the Greeks had that culture and that sort of social root. And they conquered the local people. This is around, I'd say, 2500 BC. And the previous inhabitants of Greece were the Cretans, or the Mycenae, the Minoans. And the Minoans are relatively famous for ruling an area the size of New Jersey, where Crete, south of Greece, it's this island, it's pretty small, and it was the first European civilization. And we've picked up some stuff from the Minoans. They had a really beautiful art system. The myth of the Minotaur is about them. We think that they had a democracy and some sense of human rights. They also are the first people to have a European artistic style. And the Minoans grew weak, and then they were conquered by the Mycenaeans, who usurped them. And the Mycenaean state, like all the other Bronze Age states, was on kind of weak foundations. And so when the Sea Peoples, who were this people from modern Italy, we think, the Sea Peoples attacked across the entire Mediterranean, and they wiped out states in Turkey, in Greece, in Syria. They became the Philistines later, which is interesting, where the Philistines in the Bible, they were ethnically Greek. Goliath's grandfather could have fought at Troy. And the Sea Peoples, they wiped out government in Greece, and Greece fell into a dark age. And Greece lost the ability to have writing. They lost cities. They lost centralized government. It was a dark age in Greece, comparable to the dark age that happened with the fall of Rome, that resulted in the rise of Western civilization. And then what occurred is that it forced the Greeks to restructure their entire society. And the Greeks relearned writing from the Phoenicians, where the Phoenicians were traders in Lebanon. And so our alphabet, which the Greeks invented a version, and the Latins and the Italians made our alphabet. But the Greek alphabet is based off Phoenician principles. And interestingly, the structure of modern science came from astrology that the Greeks learned from the Middle East. The Babylonians used astrology, and astrology, even though it is subjective and kind of silly, it does require precision and a logical structure. And so the first progenitor to science was astrology. And so with this dark age, the Greeks were forced to restart, and a dark age is one of the best things that can ever happen to a society, where it forces people to figure their crap out again, to figure out what's going wrong, and the out of the Greek Dark Age came a lot of interesting social formations, and it was this gradualistic process, kind of similar to how Europe pulled out of its Dark Age with the Middle Ages. And the most interesting book on this topic, and probably the best book on this topic, is Fustel de Coulanges' The Ancient City. And the thesis of the book is that the entire Greek social structure was built off the warband, where the Greeks would fight with spears, and so you had these ranks called hoplites of guys with spears and shields who were heavily armored. And in that system, everyone had to fight together. It democratized the society. If you want to know a society's political system, look at its military structure. And the Greeks were the best people in the world at foot soldiers or infantry, while they barely had archers or cavalry. And with this came this shared concept. And the Greek social structure was built upon the blood of the warbands. You have a city like Athens or Thebes or Macedon, and there's the shared ethnos or the shared tribe, and everything is built around the tribe. And in the Greek religious system, religion was passed on through blood. And so you had to give religious offerings to the gods of your ancestors. And so family line went down through blood, and so it's why it was so difficult for the Greek city-states to integrate each other. Where if Athens conquered neighboring states, they couldn't make them Athenians because the Athenian identity was fundamentally driven off blood. And it was a very religious society, but not religious in the way that we understand, where their religion was about, like, you would sacrifice a goat to Zeus, and then Zeus wouldn't hurt you. And inside that warband was very high social trust. And the Greeks had the highest social trust of anyone in the world at that point, where inside the same city-state, people were pretty kind to each other. They were pretty, the social trust of the Greeks is what allowed them to do such incredible things in their history. Inside the city-state, the Greeks had no concept of freedom. And that's something where we project a lot of our social structure onto the Greeks, where we think they were freedom-loving and capitalist and that stuff. No. Greece was a collectivist clan society where everything was done through an interpersonal relationship. Let's say if you're a baker, you make bread for... You pick a wealthy patron who protects you, then you make bread for him for free, and then he protects you. Or everything is built around your family and your extended relations. And in Greek cities, the state was allowed to do anything because it's not really a state, it's the shared community. The community was allowed to take your stuff. It was allowed to make you die in battle, make you attend certain events. And all of the Greek city-states had this kind of nanny state, very interfering sense of against personal life. It's a society with no concept of freedom. And like every pre-industrial society, there was no concept of privacy either. And that is a good lead into the different kinds of Greek societies, because the Greeks were very diverse inside the different types of social structures they had, where the two easiest and most popular polarities are Athens versus Sparta, because Athens and Sparta are opposites, where the Spartans, both Athens and Sparta, actually fit into this very not free society, even though they were democracies. There was a certain period of about 100 years where almost every state in the Greek world was a democracy. Even Sparta was partly a democracy where you would elect the king. What happens next is that the Spartans developed their society around militarism, because the Spartans were a small elite, around 10% of the population, and they usurped the local Helot population, where Sparta is in the south of Greece. And all of these Greek states are super important, but keep in mind, each Greek city-state is roughly the size of like a county in where I grew up in Pennsylvania. These very tiny areas completely changed the course of history. And Sparta was this warrior culture, where I just read this thing on Twitter where there was a Spartan ritual where every 10 days, young men would stand outside naked and have other people look at them to see if their bodies were perfect. And my comment is, that sounds gay as hell, but that's against the point. And in Sparta, what happened was that at age 7, everyone was forced to leave their families and go into the government-sponsored military training. So you spent your entire life from ages 7 to 20 doing military training. And this was a society where it was obsessed with strength, where Spartans weren't allowed to have money or even live soft lives. You were in the military until you were past age 40. You were only allowed to allowed to rarely see your wife, just sleep with her to produce kids. And Sparta actually had the best treatment for women of any of the Greek societies. Spartan women were given legal near independence, while in Athens they treated women like the Taliban does today. And Sparta, it created this like alpha male warrior society. And Sparta was a cohesive society at the expense of enserfing most of the population. And Athens and Sparta are interesting as you see multiple threads for them, where the Nazis and the communists in Plato were all basing the ideal society upon Sparta. Any single totalitarian government today probably sees Sparta as the society they want to have. So Sparta, at the expense of this, was a very uncreative, very undynamic society. It was just stagnant. And the reason the Spartans and the Athenians went to war was that Athens' social structure allowed creativity more easily than Sparta's did. So Athens was rising faster than Sparta, and the Spartans didn't want to deal with it. And so the duality, the other side of this, is Athens, where Athens was a capitalist, a libertarian a capitalist, libertarian, pluralist society. So Sparta did have a democracy. It was a relatively managed democracy, though. And there is a famous ancient quote where the Spartans and the Greeks took great pride in being free, as in they didn't have a king. And the Spartans said, "We are the freest people in the world." And then the joke is, a non-Spartan said, "Yeah, you're so free you put yourselves in chains," because their social structure was that rigid. And so they would elect two different kings, and the Greeks cared a lot about preventing tyrants from rising to power. And tyrant is actually a Greek word, where these Greek states, they would be democracies. The democracy would fall apart. A tyrant would show up. And tyrant was actually originally a positive word, where the tyrant was like this nice guy who rose to power, and he would give the mob authority in exchange for fixing the society. Then it becomes a democracy again. It wasn't always that nice. Even Athens had tyrants, where the tyrants often became tyrannical. And Greece went through this whole process where, so Greece started out as this noble society, and then the nobility lost power as the spearmen got more power, and then it became democratic. And there was this whole period of class warfare. And so for all of the ancient Greek city-states for this whole period, there was a lot of war between the lower and the upper classes. And if anything killed ancient Greece, it's class warfare, where you got to a certain point where the classes refused to cooperate. And so in Athens, as an example, you had a wise man named Solon, and Solon developed a legal code for Athens in which the different tribes inside Athens had different legal rights. And then the upper and the lower classes had different representation inside the democracy. So Athens established this pluralistic system where there was constant debate, and you had to debate different political positions. And so Athens became, I've seen analyses by why Athens had such a powerful cultural flowering. And it's a combination. Athens was a capitalist society where the Greeks were huge merchants. The Greeks traded everything from Spain to Ukraine, and later on down to India. But they have to conquer the Middle East first. And so partly it's trade between a lot of locations. And so the Athenians knew a lot about the world in a way like, say, the Spartans didn't. And then most people in Athens were slaves, where only about 15% of the population could vote in Athens because women couldn't vote. Athens treated women comparably to how the Taliban treats women today. So whenever you imagine Pythagoras, whenever you imagine Plato and Aristotle and that stuff, just assume there are no women involved. Women weren't allowed to go to the marketplace or the agora or any of those places during the Athenian Golden Age. And also, most of the population were slaves. If most people are slaves, you don't have to worry about stuff like how to put bread on the table because the slaves work for you. And so trading system, slaves. Then you have if Athens was having a brief empire at that point, the Persians need to fight the Greeks before we get to that. And then there was a democracy. And so if you have a democracy, you have to debate positions. And that's how philosophy started, where philosophy started because you had to debate different mental positions for there to be a democracy. And there was this social class called the sophists, and sophists were intellectual lawyers. You would pay a sophist to argue any points you wanted. And so they were this social class that was known for corruption and basically being lawyers. And Greek law was very advanced. The Greeks had rule of law when almost no other cultures did. And I think that's a big reason the Greeks were so successful, because you can almost perfectly correlate rule of law with a society's wealth. And so you have the two sides of the duality, Athens and Sparta. And we only think about Athens today, and there were lots of other Greek states. And something I'm going to throw out here is that in the Greece's Golden Age, there were more Greeks living in Turkey and Italy than in Greece itself. Because the Greeks, as Herodotus called them, were frogs around the pond, where you had Greek colonies all around. And the Greeks populated the Mediterranean climate zone region, where you can perfectly correlate Greek and Phoenician settlement based off regions that have a Mediterranean climate. You had Greek states in Spain, in Italy, in parts of Ukraine. The coast of Turkey was all Greek. Greece itself. And you had Greek colonies in Libya as well. So the Greeks were frogs around the pond, and the Greek cities, the Greek states in Italy and in Turkey were wealthier than the Greek states in Greece itself. If you actually wanted to find the most important Greek city-state, for most of Greece, it would be Syracuse in Sicily in southern Italy. And Syracuse is where Pythagoras came from. Pythagoras was one of the most important early Greek philosophers, and he ran a cult. He developed a lot of modern mathematics, and he developed a cult that made killing animals and eating beans illegal. And they had really complex ideas around the soul, and modern leftism is based off Pythagorean philosophy. And then you have a bunch of places in Greece itself, and a lot of these places are forgotten, and Will Durant's book on this topic is probably the best, and Will Durant goes through all these city-states. And reading it, I'm like, damn, there's this weird little city-state in the middle of Greece that was doing cool stuff. I had never heard of them, but it's nice that they were doing cool stuff. And then as the third option, you have Thebes, where Thebes was the biggest Greek city-state in population, but Thebes doesn't really fit on any of the axes, where Thebes, I think it was an oligarchy. And Aristotle divided all Greek regimes into monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. Thebes, I think, was an oligarchy. It was very wealthy, but it was on a different track than Athens or Sparta. And what I want to show here is that, like, the Greeks had huge cultural diversity. They did a variety of things. They were probably the most culturally diverse of the civilizations I know of. Because even in India is a huge place. It's much bigger than Greece, had more ethnicities, more people. The differences between the different Indian city-states or different Chinese city-states, I don't think their social structure was as different as between the different Greeks. And the Greeks had all these differences, but they were unified by this shared religion and this shared sense of being Greek, or Hellene, or the Greeks called themselves Hellenes. It's the origin of the word Hellenic. This religion was based around the worship of the gods in Mount Olympus. And the Greeks thought the gods lived in this area of northern Greece, in this mountainous area called Mount Olympus. And the Greek mythology was not based around morals. It was the gods were stronger and you worship strong things. In the ancient world, God equals powerful. So that's why ancient societies thought a king could be a god, because if a king has power equal to a god, he de facto is a god. And the Greek religion over this time period got weaker. And one of the most important stories that's never told about ancient Greece is that the death of religion is what killed Greece, because over this time period, the Greeks rationalized their society, but as they analyzed and rationalized their society, they also killed it, because the Greek culture, the Greeks lost the ability to have vitality or courage or those sorts of things. And it's funny, the Babylonians or the Egyptians, they lost their civilizations and they went into decline for being too religious. The Greeks did the opposite. And so over time, the Greeks believed in their gods less and less the more rational they got. And they tried to counter this with mystery religions. And this is one of the elements we only talk about half of the Greeks. We think the Greeks were inherently rational and they were deeply democratic and principled and controlled and civilized. The reality is the Greeks were also barbaric. They were religious fundamentalists. It was a dirty society. It was based off slavery. And for every historic time period, what we think about that society tends to be true, but the opposite that we don't think about also tends to be true. And so with the Greeks, religion is a huge thread. And so the way the Greeks saw thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras and more is that they saw them as religious figures, where they were prophets of the hidden Orphic religion. And Orpheus was this prophet from Thrace, and Thrace is it's an ethnic barbarian area in modern Bulgaria. And so the Orphics, this prophet taught these secret rituals where he went into Hades, into the underworld. And then he taught the secret rituals on how to find the divine. And the Dionysian cult, which supposedly came out of Turkey, the Dionysian cult, which supposedly came out of Iran, taught the same thing. And so with these sorts of things, the Greeks were very rational in one part of their lives, and they'd go crazy, they'd do drugs, they'd dance themselves into hallucinations on the other side. So you had these secret societies where you were not allowed to say what happened. You would do these crazy rituals. And the Greek interpretation of Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras is they were prophets of the Orphic religion. In their worldview, those people were religious figures who went into the spirit world and uncovered philosophic truths. We've made them become seen as rational because we're in a Christian society where you're not allowed to look at the religious interpretations of those thinkers. And over time, though, religion got weaker in ancient Greece, and so Greece fell into degeneracy. And then over time, it was gradually replaced by Christianity. Do you have any questions so far?
Yeah, say more about how it went into degeneracy.
Yes. So it's comparable to the modern West, and where as the West lost the shared value system given to it by Christianity, you lost the ability to either have cooperation across social classes, not rip people off, the ability to have the courage to fight or to have kids or to believe in stuff. And so Greece went through this process of nihilism and degeneracy that is very comparable to our society, where we have records of the Greeks just losing the will to live. And we're going to cover this in a future episode we make on Hellenism, because we're in the period Greece is doing well. We're going to cover the period they do badly in the next Greek episode. But so you have records of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks would open their gates to let the Romans in to conquer them. And you have records of the Greeks not having children and the Greek countryside being empty. And you know a society is dead when it invites invaders to kill them, and when it stops having kids, and when it doesn't believe in God.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, having done this show for you for a bunch of hours, I realize there are very common historic patterns we see all the time in these episodes. And if you read history, they're completely obvious, but to most people, it would never occur to them. And it's crazy that you can have dozens of examples of something happening historically, and we're still weirded out by it and can't figure out the pattern. And
like, is there a common? So we see common patterns of degeneracy or sort of like spiraling. Do we see it come back,
yes.
Or is it just like the empires fall and then
the historic patterns for a new strong society is that it's rural, it believes in itself, it has a high birth rate, it has a sense of religion. It has a sense of morality that transcends life, that being honorable is more important than living. And it's willing to make mistakes. And so that's the pattern for societies on the rise. So if you see a society, also there's social trust and there's sense of cultural unity. If you see a society with those traits, assume it's going to do very well in the future. And so
why rural?
Because this is something Spengler taps into, where societies tend to form in rural, and then they blow up into cities. And then once they blow up into cities, they can extend their growth further. And then they calcify and they lose creativity. And then there's the Dark Age. And I think it's probably due with rural societies are closer to what humans evolved with. And so it creates this sense of social trust and rootedness to the earth, which allows creativity. And then as your society gets more urban, you lose the ability to interact with the world for what it is. And you start interacting with people so you build the institutions to fight nature. And then once you've fought nature, you build institutions to manage human societies, and then those become disconnected from nature. And that's the thesis of a book I have called The Collapse of Complex Civilizations by Tainter, where he says what happens is you fight nature, then you build up the system. The system becomes so complicated that one part of it can break, and then the system breaks.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah. So to get back to Greece, the first part of Greek philosophy in the first Greek Golden Age was in modern Western Turkey. And as I said before, Western Turkey was the wealthiest place in early Greece, where you have the Milesian philosophers. And the Milesian philosophers invented the scientific hypothesis, where they said that all of existence is water. And that might not mean what people think it does, because from alchemical and hermetic philosophy, water is constant fluidity. So what they might be trying to say is that the world is constantly mixing atoms and constantly breaking apart and flowing around. I don't know. They could have also legitimately believed that the world is water. And you have thinkers like Democritus or Thales that come out of the Milesians in the west coast of Turkey. And Turkey has been Greek for over 3,000 years. And the Turks for the western third of Turkey, it was Greek until 100 years ago, and then the Turks kicked them out and genocided the local Greek population. And then the western third of Turkey, there was a kingdom called Lydia, and Lydia is where Midas's golden touch. He was the king of Lydia, and Lydia was to the Greeks what Canadians are to Americans. They're culturally very close, but they're technically different. And then what happened is that the Persians conquered Western Turkey, or as it was called then, Anatolia. People get super triggered when I call this era of history, when I call it Turkey, because the Turks only came later. But at this point, there are certain things I say purposely to trigger people. Like I call the Netherlands Holland. It's just not a meaningful difference, and it triggers people. And so the Persians came out of the east, and the Persians conquered the Greek settlements in Libya and in Turkey and in northern Greece, like the area around Thrace and Macedonia. And actually, Alexander the Great's family and the family that later conquered the Persians, they were founded as the governors of the Persian province of Macedonia. And the Persians are legitimately the most impressive empire in world history up to the Romans or the Chinese, where the Persians ruled an area longer than the current United States in size. And this was 500 BC. And certain authors say that a majority of the world's population lived in the Persian Empire, because this was the era where the Persians dominated almost the entire urbanized world except India and China. And Persia was a relatively humane kingdom where the Persians were the nicest guys up to that point. They respected culture. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, he was written up for everyone as being the greatest ruler ever. Even Cyrus's enemies, like the Jews or the later Christian authors or the Greeks, they would write up Cyrus as like he is legitimately the greatest ruler ever. So there were a lot of benefits to Persia, but Persia still was this oriental despotism that crushed creativity. And so people say, if the Persians conquered Greece, would the Greeks still have had their cultural revolution? And the short answer is no, because after the Persians conquered the west coast of Turkey, they just stopped creating new stuff. And Dan Carlin's got a wonderful podcast talking about both Persia and the Persian-Greek wars. And there's this funny story from Herodotus, and Herodotus was the inventor of modern history. He was in Athens, where the king of Lydia, the Greek-speaking state, he went to the Oracle of Delphi. And the Oracle of Delphi was this oracle that all of Greece shared, and she would give you advice. And the Oracle of Delphi was originally a teenage girl, and they were smelling fumes that caused mental intoxication. And so the irony is that the Oracle of Delphi was a politically biased organization. And so it would give out predictions for the political biases of the Oracle, that's just too real. Like, you think magical Oracle is God and objective. No. And so the Oracle was pro-Persian because the Persians bribed the Oracle to be a psyop. And so they kept on giving pro-Persian advice to the Greeks. So the king of Lydia asked the Oracle of Delphi, do I attack Persia? And the oracle said, if you attack Persia, a great empire will fall. His empire fell. And so the Persians wanted to conquer Greece itself, and they actually allied with the Carthaginians in North Africa to attack the Greeks in Italy too. But the Persians first went after Athens because Athens was a state that had helped the Greek-speaking rebels in Western Turkey. And so the Persians sent a fleet out to conquer Athens. And it's funny, I've read a lot of military histories, and they frequently call the Athenian general's move against the Athens genius. But when the Persians landed and they were still preparing to fight, the Athenian general just said, attack now. And so he attacked the Persians before they were ready and destroyed them. It's called the Battle of Marathon. And I've read enough military history to realize that something profoundly simply stupid at the right time can be genius. Just attack at the right time is genius. And so this humiliated the Persians, and because the Persians had never lost, and they lost to a city-state the size of Delaware, and that was humiliating. And so the Persian emperor, I was going to say czar, the Persian emperor Xerxes, he had a slave, or at least this is the Herodotus account. History is strange, though. History is strange enough that this could be true. Xerxes asked his slave every single day before dinner, remind me that Athens must be destroyed. So the Athenians clearly did piss off an emperor, a continental-sized emperor. And so they built up another army, and I don't really trust the Greek sources. The Greek sources say that the Persians had an army of 1 million men, and they would drink rivers dry. And we think the real number is more like 300,000. And the Persians amassed this army, and they decided to attack Greece by land. And so they walked over Turkey, walked over Macedonia, then down into Greece. And so the Greeks formed this coalition of all these states together. And in real situations like this, you determine who is fake and who is cool, where the cool Greeks banded together to fight off the Persians, and there were lame Greeks who helped the Persians. And the cool Greek confederacy included Athens and Sparta. And I think Thebes went with the Persians. And so this is where the story of 300 comes in, where there were actually about 1,200 men who were guarding this mountain pass called Thermopylae, where Thermopylae is between the mountains and the sea. So it's this tiny area. And the Spartans had these amazing infantry. And so these 1,200 Spartans could hold off an army of 300,000 Persians for a week, because the Persians could only filter through this tiny area where the Spartans could use their better soldiers. And then a local farmer taught the Persians how to go around the mountain to kill the Spartans. But in the meantime, Thermopylae is one of the most heroic battles ever. And it bought time for the Athenians and the Spartans to start building up their military. And so the Persians went down Greece. They sacked Athens and burned Athens to the ground, while the Athenians moved their entire population onto a neighboring island, because Athens was a naval society. And so the Athenian leader asked the Oracle of Delphi, how do we protect Athens from the Persians? And they said, make walls of wood. And he interpreted that as build up a navy. And that's what the Athenians did. And then the Athenians, through clever tactics, wiped out a Persian navy twice their size at the Battle of Salamis, where they rammed the Persians into a naval small channel and then killed them. And so with the complete destruction of the Persian navy that was manned by Phoenicians and other Greeks, the Persians couldn't supply their army. And so the Persians had to send back most of their army back to the empire. Well, they had a smaller army that was left in Greece. And so the Spartans developed an army, brought out an army from their peninsula, and then wiped out the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. And thus, with the second Greco-Persian War, the Greeks were able to wipe out a Persian army that outnumbered them by some ridiculous margin, something like 4-1. And so this created this sense of profound pride and just happiness among the Greeks, that they fought off this giant empire and they were able to do it so gloriously. And so after this came this period of profound optimism in Greece, where they did all this really cool stuff. And this is Athens' golden age, because in the process of fighting off the Persians, the Athenians built up this colonial empire across the Aegean, which included all these islands and peninsulas and the west coast of Turkey at some point. And so the Athenians used their empire and they put it into the great golden age. And I've read histories of ancient Greece that are 600 pages, and 400 are just on Athens in that time period. That's how much the Athenians made this cultural explosion. And if you want to know more about the philosophy, watch the Axial Age video we've released. But the Athenians invented they did so much in they invented modern philosophy, theater, a lot of architecture, the field of history, so many things were invented in Athens by a citizen population of like 15,000 guys over a generation. It's just absolutely incredible to watch. And the Athenians made such a quantum leap forward that you just stare at it and you think, how the hell do you guys do that? And it's like so many of our assumptions when you go back to see how much the Greeks have done, you realize that our concept of logic is Greek, our concept of how we see ourselves in the world, our history writing, our concept of how to write a plot for a story, it all stems from the Greeks. And I don't know what we would have done without the Greeks, where society would have taken a completely different direction. And so it's intensely impressive. And at the same time, though, this Athenian golden age was very brief, where it was built on this peace that was pretty transient between the Persian wars and the wars between the Spartans and the Athenians. Do you have any questions?
No, I'm just trying to keep up with everything. Yeah, good for now.
Yeah. So Thucydides, who was the Athenian commander at a certain point, he wrote one of the best histories ever, where Herodotus was the first historian, and then Thucydides was he wrote the most compelling history. And Thucydides has all this stuff like concepts that historians today still struggle with, like motivation or concept of time or like the character. And Thucydides hits a lot of very advanced concepts. And Thucydides said that the Peloponnesian Wars between the Spartans and the Persians occurred due to Athens was rising faster than Sparta, where Sparta was the traditionally stronger player. And then what happened is that as Athens was growing faster, Sparta felt it had to attack Athens before Athens got stronger. And this is something called Thucydides' trap. It's applied recently to U.S.-Chinese relations, where the U.S. has to start a war with China before China grows stronger than us. And you can apply Thucydides' trap to World War I and a bunch of other conflicts. And so Athens and Sparta had a war. And our convention of history is that we view the Athenians as nice guys and the Spartans as barbarians. But the irony is that the Athenians were hated by their empire. They were seen as preening, arrogant, entitled, preachy, while the Spartans were isolationists, so they were loved by their empire. And so it's interesting that the Spartans held together their coalition more easily than the Athenians did, where you had the Delian League and you had the Athenian League, and then you had the Peloponnesian League. And the Peloponnesian War lasted for a really long time. It lasted for over a generation, and it just bled Greece white. And the Peloponnesian War is to Greece what the world wars were to Europe. Where Europe before the world wars, all of this cultural, technological, economic, military, social creativity, Europe got nuked by the world wars. And then what happened is that the same thing occurred to Greece. And the Peloponnesian Wars was the unraveling of the Greek Golden Age. And the Greeks had another Golden Age called the Hellenistic period, but that's a completely different context. And over the Peloponnesian Wars, Greece had a version of the Black Death that killed a third of the population, and the Greeks stopped being democracies because they stopped having the foot soldiers and the hoplites, where it was a democracy when every guy fought. But after a generation of warfare, normal people couldn't fight because all the young men were dead. So you started hiring mercenaries and professional armies. And when the government has professional armies, this is why the founding fathers didn't trust professional armies, by the way. The government has the power, not the men. And so Athens gradually degraded into corruption. And a lot of Plato's criticism of democracy came from seeing how corrupt Athens became. And then after a generation of warfare, Athens gradually got worn down more so than Sparta. And this wasn't a war that was especially predetermined. Athens could have won the war, but Athens sent the pride of its manhood out to Sicily and Syracuse and the Greek city-state there. And Syracuse was one of the few states in the Greek world that could rival Athens in power. And because the Syracusans, they had made some overtures to the Spartans. And Pericles, who was the greatest Athenian leader, he was much like Bismarck, the German leader before World War I, where he said, don't fight the Spartans, be careful with how we spend men, and all that sort of thing. And the next leader, Alcibiades, and Alcibiades was a weird dude. He was super charismatic. He was this Athenian statesman. He betrayed Athens, then he fled to the Greeks, then he betrayed the Greeks, then he fled to Athens. You should read the Wikipedia entry on Alcibiades. And there was this incredibly aggressive, arrogant idea of let's just conquer Sicily. But then the Athenian expedition to Sicily was so poorly led that the entire Athenian army got wiped out. And so that's what turned the tide of the war. And then at the end, the Spartans were able to beat Athens. And then this led Greece to become more oligarchic, less capitalist, and less philosophical, where the Spartans turned Athens into a client state of theirs. And the Persians had been playing this game the whole time, where the Persians realized it wasn't in their self-interest to conquer Greece. They should just fund the Greeks killing each other. So the Persians kept on paying the Greeks to kill each other until Greek society went into a decline. And thus, the Peloponnesian Wars just bled Greece white, and the Greeks lost the will to fight because so many of their men had died, and they lost optimism. And so Sparta had also been so weakened, they couldn't afford to really keep Greece running. And so Thebes, which is a state to the north, they had their own period where they briefly dominated Greece. And a lot of this is based off military styles, where the Athenians had the best infantry, but then these Thebans started using archers and horsemen. And then with archers and horsemen, they could wipe out an entire Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra, which was traumatic because the Spartans, their whole thing was the military. So if they lose the military, they lose everything. And over time as well, the Spartans became degenerates, and they stopped being so manly. They started having inequality. They stopped having children. So that's a sign that even the most masculine, Chadley society does fall into degeneracy. Because if the Spartans go degenerate, everyone goes degenerate. And the Thebans were never really able to cement their authority until Macedonia came down. And Macedonia was this barbarian state culturally related to the Greeks in modern Macedonia and North Greece. And the Macedonians were a big state. They conquered modern Bulgaria and that whole region. They were the biggest state in Greece. Another example of the outsider strategy winning, where conquer barbarians, then turn back and conquer the civilized world. And the Macedonians had the greatest Greek philosopher and the greatest Greek king, where Philip of Macedon unified the barbarian tribes. And the Macedonians made such good soldiers because they, as a barbarian people, they still had the will to fight, while the Greeks didn't. And so he standardized these barbarian peoples, and there was more social mobility among the Macedonians than among the other Greeks. And he turned the Macedonian nobility into incredible shock cavalry. And so Philip of Macedon was the greatest statesman of Greek history, and his son was Alexander the Great. And he conquered all of Greece, and Greece was unified by a barbarian people, or the Macedonians were half barbarian, half civilized. And he gradually consumed the Greek city-states. And by the end, it was just pathetic, where the Greek city-states, they were constantly squabbling. They couldn't get anything done. They were depressed. And so Macedonia unified the Greeks, and then with that was able to use the vigor of the Greeks to conquer the entirety of the Middle East and the known world. Because Philip of Macedon was the greatest ruler up to that point in history, in Greek history, but his son was so much greater that it makes Philip of Macedon look weak. And so this opens up to the next chapter of Greek history, that being Hellenism, when the Greeks had their giant colonial empires in the Middle East and North Africa.
And should we get into that, or should we?
No, that's another episode. That's another 300 years. We covered like 500 years in this episode. Most of it was in the Greek Dark Ages. Or no, we covered 1200 BC to 350 BC. So that's 900 years, but most of it we glossed over in the Dark Ages. There's another 300 years with Hellenism. And also Aristotle is an interesting thing here, where Aristotle was a Macedonian who moved down to Athens, and Aristotle was the end of Greek philosophic creativity, where Socrates knew Socrates knew Plato, and Plato was a student of Socrates, and then Aristotle was a student of Plato. So these three guys who were friends created Western philosophy. And if you want to know more, watch the video on the Axial Age. But after Aristotle, the Greeks stopped being creative, the Greeks became creative technologically and religiously, but not philosophically, where Socrates invented the idea of using rational questioning. Plato invented the concept of philosophy, and Plato was more of a mystic than anything else. He invented the concept of a spiritual realm of ideas. And then Aristotle created intellectual codification, where Aristotle was the guy who wrote the book on everything. He wrote the book on rhetoric, on politics, on ethics, on anything you could possibly imagine. But Aristotle's attempt to categorize the world was the attempt to simplify the world and make it more useful for people. And so that kind of signaled the weakening of Greek creativity. And after Aristotle, it kind of shows that you weren't allowed to criticize Aristotle for the next 2,000 years. Until the invention of science in the 1600s, Aristotle just had the correct opinion on medicine or ethics or that stuff. And it signifies that the Greeks had spent their creativity, but they were willing to do stuff afterwards. And it also signifies that there wasn't a period of equal philosophic creativity to the Greeks until the modern West, which is a stunning compliment to the Greeks in of itself, that they set a parallel that the rest of history was that willing to follow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there anything before wrapping that we didn't yet get to before getting to the books? Like, a lot of people talk about this topic. You alluded to it a little bit, but what do you think are the greatest misunderstandings or things that are underappreciated about this era?
You're going to ask me about Bronze Age pervert. I haven't read his book yet. His thesis sounds plausible. The idea that the nobility mixing to create eugenics that made philosophy, I would need to read his book to actually get his argument. As far as I understand it, I don't have any argument against it, but I'd have to see the evidence. Where the Greeks did have eugenics, where like in Sparta, if there was a strapping young man or like a Chad, the Chad had the legal right to sleep with any woman who agreed to because his genetics were so good. That's how their society worked. And so they would also let out, if you didn't like a baby, you were just allowed to let it die. it was abortion after birth. So the Greeks were into eugenics. So that's the far right perspective on it. The left hasn't really, like, the left doesn't think about ancient history anymore. And the misconception I see the most with the ancient Greeks is that we gas them up a lot. And I compare it to the Middle Ages, where yes, the Greeks deserve to be gassed up. They're one of the most admirable peoples and most creative peoples ever. But the Greeks were also like a slave state. It was a pretty dirty society. We imagine ancient Greece to be this we imagine it to be this pure, rational, philosophic society. But in reality, it was violent, dirty, sexual, religious, all like slavery, all that stuff. We see the Greeks as being part of Western civilization, but I don't think that's true. I think Western civilization is a creation of the Middle Ages, where Greece, it was a collectivist clan society. It had no concept of freedom. It had no concept of morality in a Christian sense. It had a capitalism. It didn't have modern capitalism. It didn't have our legal system. Like, almost all of the West's modern institutions stem from the Middle Ages, where our democracy comes from medieval parliaments, and we attribute modern democracy to the Greeks. And yes, our founding fathers got a lot of their ideas from the Greeks, but the modern Congress comes from parliament. And so we attribute more similarity to the Greeks than it really deserves. And an interesting story here is that Greece, after it fell and after Alexander the Great, went through its Latin American period, where the Greek city-states were constantly being attacked by they constantly had military dictatorships and juntas and power politics, as they couldn't maintain stability. And the interesting thing is, Greece had socialism, it had feminism, which is something you don't think about. And the reason the founding fathers, upon making the American Republic, knew that we would end up with socialism and wealth redistribution is that they looked to the Greek parallel and they saw that that was the natural endpoint of like a dozen different Greek democracies. And they had the wisdom that we don't have today. And so there's a great story about Greek communism and Greek feminism, where for the communists, there was this Greek play where they were, and this is a comedy, where they asked a Greek communist, so no one's going to work, there's going to be everything's going to be held in common, no private property, so who does the work? And the Greek communist says, the slaves, of course. And that was an actual principle of Greek communism, that of course you would always have slavery, but everything's shared among the citizen class. So Greece kind of fell apart due to these very warped class politics, where because Greek capitalism died and Greece grew poor because the socialists overregulated the economy, which is a very common historic pattern. And also, Greek feminism happened pretty rapidly, where around the time of Pericles and Plato and the Greek Golden Age, as I've said multiple times before, the Athenians treated women like the Taliban treats women today. But over the next century, Greece started having feminism, where women got legal equality with men over the next century. And then there was a Greek play by Aristophanes, which talked about a society where only women voted. And in that society, it would be communist. There would be sexual communism, where to sleep with an attractive girl, you'd have to sleep with an ugly girl first. You remove the nuclear family. There's no privacy. And also, the Greek council women complain about how hard it is to be a senator while being senators, and how cold the Senate is. And they can't develop a coherent strategy. So some parts of human nature stay. And so you can draw a lot of parallels between our current society and the Greeks. And the Greeks had a level of wisdom that we're missing today.
Sexual communism. That's a new one.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard of racial communism, but I didn't know there was a sexual communism.
I mean, sexual communism exists today. It's why we have like body positivity.
Yeah, exactly. And
yeah.
Lizzo.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Any final questions?
No. Should we wrap on that?
Yeah, let me drop some books too.
Oh, yeah.
So the best book on this topic is Fustel de Coulanges' The Ancient City. I'm saying that because my background's in anthropology, but that's the anthropology book. The Life of Greece by Will Durant. This is very good, although he does have Athens derangement syndrome. I have heard that this is one of the best. I've heard that this is one of the best books in the Greeks. Sailing the Wine Dark Sea by Cahill. Rise of the West by McNeill is just like holistically the best book on any given topic. And The Classical World by Robin Lane Fox. I have not read this, but it looks very good. So those are my books.
Amazing.
Okay.
Reddit, always a pleasure, and excited
Yes.
for the next episode.
Yes, next episode is the Indo-Aryan invasions.
Awesome. Excellent.
Okay, sounds good.
Until
Peace,
then.
man. Bye.
Take care.